Welcome back. This is going to be screencast number 2 for chapter 16. And if you remember back to our very first screencast for evolution, right before we started our work sample, we had looked at 16.1 and 16.2. And for those two particular sections, they focused primarily on Charles Darwin, which is the man that you see right here. And the idea was to get a little bit of history on Charles Darwin, kind of think about the evidence that he had collected in regards to sort of proving his case that evolution actually does exist. And so in 16.3, what we're going to do is, if you notice, he's quite a bit older by this time, and this is the point where he finally felt somewhat confident that he had enough evidence to prove his theory of evolution. Now, at the very beginning of our discussion about evolution, I had mentioned to the class that there needs to be a distinction between the concept of evolution and the process under which evolution actually occurs. And in regards to evolution itself, we know that evolution simply means a change over time, a long period of time. But the process that actually allows evolution to happen is known by a different name, and we call that natural selection. And so what we're going to do in 16.3 is we're going to look at natural selection and look at the three different, I guess you would say, components that must be met in order for natural selection to occur. And the very first one we're going to look at is one called the struggle for existence. And if you remember back after Darwin had looked at some of the readings that Malthus had produced, Malthus was the scientist who, or the economist, excuse me, that had actually put forth the idea that definitely humans were being born at a much faster rate than they were dying. And in order for them to be able to survive, there had to be a struggle. There had to be basically a way to sort of keep that population in check. And in his idea, in Malthus's idea, he felt that things like disease, famine, and war helped to keep the human population in check. And Darwin had looked at this and said, well, there must be something similar in nature. So in this case, for natural selection to occur, more individuals are going to be produced than can actually survive. And so when you have any animal produce, or I should say reproduce, the offspring, the numbers that they produce, needs to be quite a bit because there needs to be some sort of struggle between those offspring. They have to be able to compete for certain resources, and those resources would be things like food, living space, could be reproductive capabilities, in other words, their ability to reproduce or find mates. There's lots of different factors that might contribute to that competition. But you can't get natural selection occurring, the idea that you want to select those that have a better chance at living in that environment unless there isn't some sort of competition. So there has to be a struggle in that population. Now, the second condition under which natural selection occurs is one called variation and adaptation. Now, of course, for there to be a struggle, there needs to be variation within the population. And of course, those that are better suited to life in their environment than others are going to probably most likely be able to survive. Now, this variation that we notice has to be some sort of heritable characteristic, which means you need to be able to pass it on to your offspring. Now, basically, any heritable characteristic that's going to increase an organism's ability to survive, we're going to give that a special name, or we're going to call it an adaptation. Now, these adaptations can be structural or they can be behavioral. And if you look over here on the right, you notice we have an example of an owl. Now, if you notice, this is a pretty unique bird because over many, many years, it's adapted to its environment in ways that allow it to be able to survive. If you notice, compared to other birds, owls have pretty significant eyes. If you notice, the eyes are typically much larger than they are in other birds because these animals tend to hunt at night, so it gives them better vision. They also have super sensitive ears, and so the ears you find in these animals compared to other birds, because of the type of prey that they do hunt, when you think about the voles, the mice, the rats, the rodents that they actually have to hunt for food, those ears become very important. If you notice down here towards the bottom, we have the talons that you would find on this type of animal, and of course it is an adaptation that has actually allowed the owls to be able to grab their food pretty effectively. And so again, these can be structural or they could be behavioral. In other words, you could have an animal that is I wouldn't say smarter than the rest of the population, but maybe they're able to reason a bit more, and that sort of gives them an edge over the others within that population. Now, the third condition under which natural selection occurs is going to be survival of the fittest. So, kind of taking into account what we had looked at in 1 and 2, we give this a special name. We call it fitness of that organism. So, fitness is simply going to be how well an organism can survive and reproduce in its environment. And you have to take both of these together, because even though it may be able to survive, it needs to be able to reproduce as well, so we can pass those characteristics on to the next generation. Now, when you talk about survival of the fittest, we're talking about those that actually have a very high fitness ranking. In other words, those are most likely going to be the ones that will be able to survive and reproduce. Then, of course, there's going to be those, of course, that have a low fitness ranking, and those would be the members of the population that are not well suited to their environment, and most likely those individuals are going to die. And when they die, of course, they probably did not get the chance to reproduce. So survival of the fittest kind of makes sense, because there's going to be some sort of struggle that's going to occur in the population, which is going to cause others to compete with each other. There needs to be some variation in order for that competition to occur. And then, of course, the main goal of most animals or most organisms in an environment is simply to survive. And of course, those, as we said, with the highest fitness are going to be the ones that survive. So in the previous slide, we had looked at the conditions under which natural selection occurs, but again, the idea of natural selection is basically just those organisms with certain variations that are best suited to their environment are going to survive and simply leave more offspring. So as we had said before, it's going to occur when you have those three conditions. You need to have more individuals that are born that can actually survive. In other words, you have to have that struggle. There needs to be a natural, heritable variation within that population. So again, looking back at what we had talked about in the previous slide, variation and adaptation are really important. And of course, as we said, there needs to be a high fitness. So only the fittest will actually survive out of that population. So if you look over here on the right, we have two examples. In this case, I believe this is a katydid that you see in this picture. If you can see it in the picture, if you notice, this animal has adapted to its environment in terms of the way that it actually looks. Because if you notice, it's really hard to pick out the insect in this picture, because over many generations, those that were able to blend in with their environment much better than others were probably the ones that were going to survive, and of course those would be the ones that would actually reproduce. And so they're going to pass those heritable characteristics onto their offspring. So over many years, they eventually become very similar to their environment in this case, and become very well camouflaged. Now down here towards the bottom, we have an example of a large moth, but if you notice, if you kind of back away from this moth a bit, you're going to notice that it kind of looks like it has some very large eyes. So if you have a predator that has come across this, what is a moth, might sort of mistake it for another animal. You know, an animal that would be much larger than what maybe that predator wants to take on. And so again, this is another way to sort of adapt to your environment, because this one with a very large pattern or the very large eyes on its wings is probably more likely to survive than one that maybe has much smaller eyes on its wings, or that pattern is much reduced than you would have in other members of the population. So again, these are the variations that are necessary in order for natural selection to occur. So as we had said, the process of natural selection is kind of the way that we sort of think about evolution occurring. Now, Darwin had proposed that over many generations, these adaptations would eventually cause new species to evolve from those populations, which means when you think about a species, you typically think about a group of animals, plants, organisms in general, that can reproduce with each other. But if the changes become so significant that they can't actually reproduce with each other, that would be the case where we actually have a new species occur. So he also proposed that living species descended with modification. In other words, they descended from what we call a common ancestor. And so if you look down here towards the bottom, we had talked about something called the tree of life, all right? And back when I had you guys watch the video on Darwin, he had sort of demonstrated or kind of illustrated what he perceived as being the tree of life. He had talked about a trunk with many branches. And at the very bottom of that tree, this would be the ancient common ancestor to all of life on this planet. That was his idea. That was his sort of hypothesis. And so we basically call that descent with modification, which means that as these animals adapted to their environment, they changed a little bit, and that basically caused these different branches of that tree of life to occur. So according to the principle of common descent, All species, living and extinct, are descended from ancient common ancestors. And right here, you would see that ancient common ancestors. So again, even those ones that we see here, the dragonfly, the tree, the crayfish, all of those animals we still have around today are related to those that are no longer around. For example, like the dinosaur that you see right here. So again, this is sort of what Darwin had come up with, the whole idea that there has to be some sort of common link among all of life on this planet. Now, the very first line of evidence that we're going to look at is called biogeography. And what you notice here is we actually have two words wrapped up into one. If you look at the prefix right here, you'll notice that bio, of course, is going to refer to biology, which means living things, and geography is going to refer to location. So when you think about biogeography, you need to think about where organisms actually live now compared to where their ancestors had lived in the past. Now, we're going to break biogeography down into two different areas. The first one being closely related organisms, but somewhat different. Now, Darwin noticed that certain species vary locally. In other words, when he had talked about his finches, he had noticed that there were several birds on these Galapagos Islands that were very similar to each other, but they had each sort of developed beaks that were a little bit different from each other based on the type of food that you found on those islands. So in this case, for biogeography, we're talking about organisms that are very closely related, but what they've done is they've actually differentiated, which means they've changed, and it's usually due to very slight climate changes that have occurred in those localized areas. So that sort of influences the type of structures that might be needed in those areas. Now, the second category of biogeography is where you discuss organisms that are distantly related, but they still appear somewhat similar. And Darwin had noticed that there were species that actually varied globally. And if you notice over here on the right-hand side, we're bringing back the idea of the armadillo. Now, it says distantly related species will develop similarities based on similar environments that they live in. So in this case, if you look at the similarities between these four animals, all of them have, well, relatively long snouts. The body shape is pretty much the same, and if you notice, all of them have a pretty significant tail. But of course, they live on different continents, and so the idea here is that on each of these different continents, we have habitats, we have environments that are very similar to each other, so the idea is that these organisms sort of evolved or changed to become very similar to each other based on the influence of that environment. Now, the second piece of evidence that we use to help to validate whether or not evolution actually occurs is the age of the Earth and the fossils that you might find on this planet. Now, back during Darwin's time, of course, he had found many, many fossils, and he helped to sort of use those to back up his concept of evolution. But during that time, it was really hard to, I guess you would say, date those fossils. In other words, you could see similarities maybe between structures of the organisms that were around during that time, and of course the fossils that they had located or found. But in terms of how you actually show that they're related to each other, it was pretty limited. But today we have lots of technology that helps us to sort of date those fossils a lot more accurately than Darwin could. And so what we have is something called radioactive dating. And so this helps us to determine the age of certain rocks, and it can also help us to determine the age of fossils as well. If you look over here on the right-hand side, you're going to notice that we have a fossil being represented right here. And so if you notice, it says that living organisms tend to absorb a certain element. It's a radioactive element. It's called carbon-14 or C14, and they do this during their lifetime. But when they become fossilized, what happens is that this particular radioactive element will begin to decay. And so what scientists could actually do is they can take a small piece of the fossil, they can burn that piece up, and they can actually get that piece to produce carbon dioxide gas. Well, from that gas, they found that there are two different types of carbon being emitted. They have what we call a stable carbon-12 that's being produced, but we also have a radioactive carbon-14 that's being produced as well. And so what a scientist will do is, since certain types of radioactive elements like carbon-14 will sort of decompose at a certain rate, and it's a pretty predictable rate, what they can do is they can actually count the number of electrons that are being produced, which is what happens when radioactive materials actually decay. They can determine the number of electrons that are being produced and get a rough idea as to how old that fossil might be. Now, of course, in addition to the technology that we now have, we also need to understand that now we actually have more fossils that have been discovered as opposed to what was looked at back in the 1800s. And so a lot of those holes, a lot of those gaps that might have been around during Darwin's time have now basically been filled in. In other words, the discovery of more intermediate stage fossils now helps to fill in those holes. And so the whole idea, for example, of, let's say for example, a fish actually developing over a long period of time to maybe become an amphibian, a reptile, a bird, or even a mammal can kind of be verified because we've found more fossils. In other words, maybe this area right here maybe wasn't recognized during Darwin's time because there were no fossils that were present, but now we've discovered many more species, many more common ancestors that show sort of a gradual development of those limbs that you would find in those modern amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals of today. Now, a third piece of evidence would be actually comparing anatomy and embryology. And what we're going to do on this screen is we're going to look at the anatomical piece in particular. Now, when you talk about anatomy, what we do is we often talk about things called homologous structures. Now, we've seen this prefix before, and we know that this prefix is going to mean same. So in this case, we have animals with similar structures that have evolved from a common ancestor with a basic version of a certain structure. And oftentimes we refer to that as descent with modification. So over here on the right towards the top, we have 4 different organisms. We have 5 different organisms. We have a frog, an alligator, a chicken, a horse, and down here we have an ancient lobe-finned fish. Now, when you talk about a lobe-finned fish, you're talking about a fish that actually has sort of a fleshy type of fin. Now, the idea here is that this would be considered the common ancestor to all of the animals that you see right here. Now, all of these animals have homologous structures because if you notice, there is a very strong similarity between the appendage or leg of this frog and the alligator and even the forelimb of the chicken where you would find the wing and of course the leg of the horse. The idea here is that all 4 of these structures actually are being used to do the same exact thing, but they've been modified over a period of time. Now we know they're similar because if you notice they're kind of color-coded here. In other words, there are certain bones that are purple, certain ones that are yellow, certain ones that are orange. Well, the idea is they're all homologous because you find those types of bones in all of these animals. And you also find it in the ancient common ancestors. So again, this is descent. These animals have descended from this ancient common ancestor, but they've been modified. Now, but you need to be very careful here. You can't confuse common structure with something called common function. Because when you look at the function of these particular structures, like down here on the right, you're going to notice we actually have 3 different examples. We have a bat wing, a bird wing, and an insect wing. All of these structures have the ability to basically allow that animal to fly. But they are not considered homologous because the structures that actually make up these 3 different types of appendages are not the same. In other words, you don't have the similarities between the bones like you see up here, so the color coding is not the same. We call them analogous structures. They're not homologous. In other words, they all 3 do the same thing, but they're much, much more distantly related from each other. Now also, you need to remember that not all homologous structures have important functions. In fact, there are a lot of them out there that are considered vestigial, which means they are inherited, but that structure has actually lost most, if not all, of their original function. Now, a good example of this is on the right-hand side here. If you think about us, we actually have muscles that are found in our ears, and if you notice, there are some people out there that can actually make their ears move. We're not quite sure why those muscles have stuck around. You know, what is the advantage to having ear muscles? What is the advantage to having an eyebrow? What is the advantage to having eyelashes? Tonsils, again, another good example of a vestigial structure. A thymus gland, you know, what is the purpose of that? Male nipples. Why do men need to have nipples? You know, they don't have to nurse their young. So again, these are all considered vestigial structures because even though they're still around and we can pass them on to our offspring, they really don't have any function in the living organism. Now again, that third piece of evidence, we had anatomy and embryology. Now this one's a pretty kind of a significant one because if you notice on the right, we have several different examples of embryos that come from different animals. For example, the rabbit, the calf, the hog, the chick, the tortoise, the salamander, and the fish. Well, the idea here is that when you look at the embryos for all of these different organisms, at the very beginning when development begins, you're going to notice they are very similar to each other in terms of shape and the structures you might find on that embryo. And actually, as you kind of progress further on, the similarities definitely do start to diminish a bit, but there's still some similarities between the organisms. Then, of course, as you progress along and you get to almost full term for each of these organisms, then, of course, they become very different. But the similar pattern of embryological development is going to provide that further evidence that there must have been some sort of common ancestor for all of the organisms that you see represented on this picture. Now, the very last piece of evidence of evolution is going to be genetics and molecular biology. Now, most of us know, of course, by this time that life has a common genetic code. So all living organisms will use DNA, of course, and RNA to carry information not only from one generation to the next, but also to direct the synthesis or the making of certain proteins in those organisms. Now, an easy way to think about this is to look at these three examples down here. We have a mouse, we have a whale, and we have a chicken. And remember that DNA code is made up of 4 different letters, the A's, the T's, the G's, and the C's. Well, what you simply need to do is you need to look at the comparison of the genetic code among all 3 of these. Now, the less difference that you have between 2 organisms, that would indicate that they are more closely related to each other. So if you compare the mouse with the whale, the only differences that you see would be here, 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 and here. So there's 4 differences between these 2 animals. That would indicate that when you compare these 2 together, which seem to be somewhat similar, in other words, more closely related, and let's say, for example, you take maybe the mouse and the chicken, when you compare them two, we have quite a few more differences taking place between those 2 as opposed to between the mouse and the whale. And so the indicator here is that the mouse and the chicken are much more distantly related from each other than the mouse and the whale. So again, just comparing those letters will allow you to be able to look at how closely related 2 organisms may be. Alright, so that's going to finish up our very last screencast for Chapter 16. Please make sure that you have completed your screencast notes before you come to class.